morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio. So today, we're going to be having a look at a buy list for the recently released Team Up set. I always get a bunch of messages from people when a new set is revealed going, hey Wossy, can we have a buy list? Now, it's a little bit later than I would like, for which I apologise. But we're here now. Couple of rules to go through just as we begin. GXs generally are very expensive, so my advice generally tends to be only go and spend money on these if you're really convinced you want to play them. Although Pikachu and Zekrom, Pikarom as I like to call it, is probably, and by probably I mean almost certainly, going to be the most expensive and best deck in the format. Certainly the best deck, so it might be worth going for them sooner rather than later, because if it's as good as it has been in Japan, it ain't getting any cheaper. Similarly, if we're looking at things like Gyarados, for instance, which are these lovely little potential rogue decks, non-GXs, etc., things that are really their own deck, I'm not going to be recommending you go and get these because it's an if you want to play it kind of thing. We're talking about cards that you need in your binder that you may have to chuck into decks at short notice. So starting off, you need 2 copies of PARASECT. PARASECT is a great new card whereby you add 2 damage counters to your opponent's Pokemon if they're confused between turns. You'll need it in any confusion deck you ever play. You are also going to need 2 copies of the NINETALES here. NINETALES has a great little ability that lets you discard 2 fire energy from your hand and then drag up one of your opponent's Pokemon. Very much like a Guzma without the switch. You're going to probably put that in some decks. You need 1 to 2 copies of MOLTRES. MOLTRES is a really nice tech in fire decks. 1 fire energy, discard all the fire energy attached to it, discard that many cards from the top of your opponent's deck. That's a game-ending play. And then 180 on a non-GX Pokemon can be very good. You will need 4 copies of SQUIRTLE, because this is the best SQUIRTLE we've got now. Low HP means it can be grabbed with Professor Round's lecture, but mostly here it's the ability, which means that if it's a stadium card in play, you have no retreat cost. Sorry, if you have a stadium card in play, it's the best SQUIRTLE, and this Blastoise looks good, and we're getting Blastoise GX in the future. Safe to say, ladies and gentlemen, you are going to want to have this. This is the best SQUIRTLE. Please do bear that in mind. 2 to 4 copies of Articuno. Articuno is a wonderful starting Pokemon in a whole bunch of water decks. The ability basically stops your opponent Guzmaing your water Pokemon off the bench, and the attack does 70 while moving energy to the bench, meaning that you can set up with Articuno doing a bit of damage, not losing energy, forcing your opponent to take it out. You need 2 copies of Electrode, because when you evolve into it, you can move all your lightning energy around. You might not need it now, but there's a million different lightning decks in the future that you may want to put this into. You need 2 to 4 copies of Zapdos. Zapdos, 80 damage if you became active this turn. With Jirachi, it was the best deck in Japan. It's not quite that good now since Tag Team GXs came out, but it's still a phenomenal single price, single energy lightning attacker. I think you need 4 copies of EMOLGA. It lets you search out a Nuzzle Pokemon, but we got stuff like Pachirisu that lets you accelerate energy to Nuzzle Pokemon. I think Nuzzle gonna keep coming around. I'd get 4 of these. I think you need a couple copies of Muck. If you're playing a poison deck, Muck is great. It stops your opponent evolving or devolving out of poison. Now, to be fair, Sea of Nothingness will do the same thing here, but this lets you do it while having a stadium like Shrine of Punishment out, and your opponent can't field blower it. So I think Muck could be good. You need 1 to 2 copies of STARMIE. STARMIE is fantastic energy acceleration. Free retreat, 1 energy, gets free energy out of your deck while doing 40 damage. I think it's pretty good. You need a couple of Mr. Mime. It basically stops your opponent playing Ace Roller. It is a great tech against Ace Roller decks, so I think you need a couple of them. Now, I'm going to tell you about 2 to 4 of a bunch of these, and it's essentially 2 if you think it's going to be a tech, 4 if you can see yourself building a deck around it. So 2 to 4 Alolan Muck. When you evolve up into it, you essentially get to look at the top 6 cards of your opponent's deck, discard any trainer cards. Clearly great with Garbodor, but by the same token, it's just a good tech to try and screw your opponent over, get rid of stuff like their rare candy, for instance. And along these lines, I think you need 4 Alolan Grimer, because firstly, it's a decent basic. Secondly, for a double colorless energy, it's got a good attack in a special conditions deck. You might be playing this one in and of itself. 2 to 4 copies of Absol, it both increases your opponent's retreat cost while doing more damage if they've got an increased retreat cost. That's kind of funny. 2 to 4 copies of Spiritomb lets you discard 4 Pokemon from your deck. In a format without Battle Compressor, this could be good. Maybe it's a tech, you need a couple. Maybe it's a starter Pokemon, you need 4. Similarly, 2 to 4 EVELTAL. The great thing about EVELTAL is it's got free retreat. The other great thing about EVELTAL is for a single energy, 30 damage, plus discard a special energy. Really good in darkness decks. 2 to 4 Jirachi. When it's in the active, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your deck, find a trainer card, put it into your hand. It then goes to sleep, but you free retreat with a skateboard. It gives you so much consistency. 1 to 2 copies of KLEFKI. Now, I'm not 100% convinced on KLEFKI, but it doubles your resistance if you're playing a metal Pokemon, so that could be fun in some metal decks. 2 copies of Dragonite, purely because it's Tapu Lele's ability, but it's once per turn. It's also on a Stage 2 Pokemon. I don't know if Dragonite's going to be good, but I think you need a couple copies in case it is. And then a couple copies of PIDGEOTTO. During your turn, once, you can look at the top 2 cards of your deck, 1 in your hand, 1 to the bottom of your deck. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's pretty gosh darned good. Now, going into trainers, my general advice is just get a playset of every trainer. You never know what you're going to need. Classic example of this is AZ, which everybody said for the longest time was just a 1 or 2 of. You'll never need a playset. And then Vileplume became big and everyone started playing 4 in their Vileplume decks. And no one had 4. So, I'm going to say 2 to 4, but most of them you're probably better off just getting 4. 2 to 4, Bill's analysis. Look at the top 7 cards of your deck. Find a couple of trainer cards. 1 or 2 of these are finding their way into most Japanese decks, so you need 1 or 2. Brock's Grit, I think you need 2 of these if you don't already have it, which you might because it came around in Evolutions. So I leave that one up to you, but it's great recovery. Because it's a recovery card, you probably only need a couple, but it is good. 4 copies of Buff Padding, 50 more HP if you've got a retreat cost of 4 or more. Frankly, if you've got a high retreat cost Pokemon, this is going to be a serious consideration. 4 copies of Dana. Now, Dana's one of these Battle Chateau ladies. It's very specific. You can only play it if your opponent's active as a Stage 2. You get to search for 2 cards. In a Stage 2 meta, this is great. We're also going to talk about Morgan in a moment, and you'll need it if you want to play Morgan, which you might want to, because Morgan's really good. 4 copies of Dangerous Drill. Dangerous Drill lets you discard a Darkness Pokemon from your hand, and then discard a tool, Special Energy, or Stadium. That's pretty good disruption. 4 copies of Electrocharger. It lets you recover your Electro Power, which incidentally is a really good card in Lightning decks, so you probably should have some of these on standby. 2 to 4 copies of ERIKA'S Hospitality. This is already moderately expensive and it's probably only going to go up. It's generally a 1 or 2 of in Japanese decks, but you never quite know. 4 copies of EVELYN. EVELYN is another one of these Battle Chatelaine ladies. And if your opponent's active as a Stage 1, draw 4 cards. Again, good against Stage 1 decks, also good with Morgan. We're getting there. 4 copies of Fairy Charm UB. Now, this isn't seeing a huge amount of play at the moment, but when Sylveon and Gardevoir comes out in Unbroken Bonds, this is going to see a lot more play. Means that GX and EX Ultra Beasts like Buzzwole and Blacephalon cannot do damage to you. This is huge. This is going to see play. 2 to 4 Grass Memory, and while we're here, 2 to 4 Water Memory. I mean, look, if you're playing Silvally, These are going to be great. If you're not, maybe they're not. The thing is, we never know if Silvally is going to magically become good. Having all these memory cards to turn Silvally to another type is quite nice. For INGO and EMMET, it's a decent draw supporter. Gets you 5 cards off the top or bottom of your deck. Simple as. Jasmine, good for searching out metal Pokemon. I think you need 4 of these because it's good for searching out metal Pokemon. 4 copies of Judge Whistle, because if you're going to be playing a deck that really revolves around Judge, and Celebi and Venusaur tends to play along these lines, being able to use Judge over and over and over again is a huge advantage. This lets you do so. 4 copies of Lavender Town lets you look at your opponent's hand, and if you're playing something with Poltergeist like Mimikyu and Gengar, this is going to be extremely handy, ladies and gentlemen. So you should have 4 copies. 4 copies of Metal Goggles. It's very much like Metal Frying Pan in that it reduces damage done to you by 30. Metal Frying Pan takes away weakness. Metal Goggles stops your opponent dropping damage counters. But if you're against something like Decidueye, Goggles is clearly the play. Depends what kind of meta you're in. Hey, speaking of that Morgan card, you need 4 copies of Morgan. Now, I've seen this work in Japan, though it is awkward. In order to play it, you've got to discard the other 3 Battle Chatelaine ladies from your hand, them being Dana, Evelyn, and Nita, but you then get to attach as many energy as you like from the top 12 cards of your deck. I have profiled a Rayquaza deck using this. I'll try and remember to pop a link in the description. This could be busted, and I think you need to be ready with these cards just in case. 4 copies of NANU. NANU lets you swap a basic Darkness Pokemon in your discard pile for any Pokemon on your field. Clearly, someone's going to make this amazing with Guzzlord, but this seems like there are lots of combos out there we haven't even thought of yet, which are going to be great with this. 4 copies of Nita. Firstly, you kind of need it for Morgan, but secondly, if your opponent's active is a basic, you get to put an energy from the active Pokemon on top of their deck. Takes away an energy attachment while guaranteeing they're not going to top deck that supporter they want. That's kind of fun. 4 copies of Pokemon Communication if you don't already have one. It was around in the Heart Gold Soul Silver era, so there's a good chance that especially some older players will have a playset around, but it lets you swap a Pokemon in hand for one in your deck. It's really good. 4 copies of Return Label. I don't think it's a particularly good card. Lets you put a card from your opponent's discard pile on the bottom of their deck. But I suppose against something like Night March to take away some of their damage, it could be fun. I mean, look, it's a kind of card which is rubbish, broken. I think you should be ready. I also think you need 2 to 4 copies of Sabrina's Suggestion. Lets you copy a supporter card from your opponent's hand. Risky, but could be amazing. And finally, 4 copies of Viridian Forest, because we just don't have good energy. We don't really have any good energy search right now. The best we've got is Energy Lotto, which is not reliable. This lets you discard a card from your hand and search your deck for a basic energy. Whew, we made it. That, I think, is a buy list for this. Any cards that are going to be in decks like Gyarados or Alolan Executor that you want to play, add on to the list. Similarly, GXs. I don't think there are any GXs you have to have in this set, but I do think things like Pikachu and Zekrom and Celebi and Venusaur are going to be great, and if you want to get involved in playing those decks, it's probably better to pick it up sooner rather than later, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit awkward. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I think that will do for now, but I want to hear from you guys. Are there any cards that you think people out there should be getting and adding onto their own buy list? Or do you think that I've added some cards on here that shouldn't even be on here? Either way, or maybe you want to say nice things, you never know. Either way, comment section is the place to do so. Go nuts, but please do remember the most important rule as always. Be nice, would ya? And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at The Wassy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all of that, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And do please make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassyPlays, where we talk about all things, well, other games. But by far the most important thing, as always, Look after yourselves until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCGRadio.